Here, and this is a vacation update, probably the last vacation update unless something unforeseen happens. We've been working on new video ideas and whatnot, and have something planned to come back with to kind of celebrate the 4th of July. So that should be coming pretty soon. And because what's more American than German stuff, I thought I would do another model and gun video. Mostly just because I picked up a new Luger the other week. This is a 1915, so World War I era. It's not double marked or anything, so probably hasn't been redone after the war. Has all this drawing and stuff. And just for comparison, I brought out my by now trusty World War II so-called Black Widow, although of course the Germans never did. So I thought we would just kind of compare them. Why not? And for the model part, I brought out some German warships. In the past, we've done a couple of videos showing die-cast models. They were 1/700 scale, so relatively large. These are 1/1100 scale by Eagle Moss in their Warships of the World collection, which is actually a Japanese exclusive. And so here we have the Deutschland class cruiser Graf Spee, Admiral Graf Spee. Next, here we have the Prince Juergen of the Admiral Hipper class cruisers, and we have the battleship Scarnhorst of the Scarnhorst class. And then finally, just because I brought out again the Bismarck, although we've already done a full video on it, so but yeah, just to kind of put it in perspective. And that's what's kind of neat about scale models, as you can see the sizes and basically how Germany progressively thumbed its nose more and more at the Versailles Treaty and later the London Naval Treaty and the German Anglo Naval Agreement. And you know, honestly, the same could be said for Lugers and how restrictions were placed on the country by the Treaty of Versailles, and how obviously after you-know-who came to power, they quickly started disregarding them, first covertly and then eventually just openly. So yeah, I really wanted to talk mostly about the Graf Spee in this video because it's a neat story and kind of the first of Germany's rebuilding ships. But before we get to it, let's just briefly talk about the others here. The Deutschland class cruisers came before the rest, but this is just a casual hangout, having fun, talking about guns and ships with big guns on them. So hey, let's talk about the Admiral Hipper class, which was 5 heavy cruisers, and probably the most famous of them is Prince Juergen. That's because she was Bismarck's escort during Operation Rheinwang, where they tried to break out into the Atlantic to do some good old commerce raiding and generally harassment of the Allies. This class of ship dates back to 1935 in the Anglo-German or German-Anglo agreement. It was said that Germany could build 5 10,000-ton or less, but yeah, let's be real, cruisers. So Germany laid down this class in 1935 1936. Prince Juergen was number 3 of 5. She was launched in 1938 and then completed, commissioned, and in service by 1940. So, okay, maybe she wasn't exactly 10,000 tons, maybe a little heavy. You know, everyone puts on a little weight. No, she was 17,000 tons, and that was light load. She was over 18,500 tons fully loaded. Yeah, they nearly doubled what they were supposed to. She's nearly 700 feet long. She has 8 8-inch guns and super firing forward and rear turrets. She has a dozen 4-inch guns as her secondary battery, and then, you know, a host of other ordnance for anti-aircraft and torpedoes and whatnot. She also carried Arado 196 planes for reconnaissance. She had 3 screws and was actually quite fast. She could get up to 32 knots, which is pretty damn good considering her size. She certainly wasn't without her flaws, but yeah, she successfully worked with Bismarck in 1941 in May when they sank HMS Hood and severely damaged Prince of Wales. A lot like this ship's counterpart in a lot of ways. It was a battleship, but yeah. And from there, she would go to France for repairs. Then she would be Operation Cerberus, the Channel Dash, to get back to Germany. She would be in other operations throughout World War II. But one notable thing about Prince here, she survived the war, which is more than you can say for most German, Japanese, and even Italian ships. And after the British captured her, she was given to the USA as a war prize, and the US knew just what to do with her. In 1946, that summer, during what was known as Operation Crossroads, they nuked her. And believe it or not, she survived the nuking. So she was towed and capsized at the end of that year, and actually today, the Prince Juergen wreck is a popular dive site over in the Pacific. So, yeah, that's a thing. What about Scarnhorst? Scarnhorst is a battleship, or perhaps a battle cruiser, depending on your exact definition. The lines are very blurred by the time of World War II. She was ordered in 1934 to replace an obsolete German warship. Not to get way deep into the terms of the Versailles Treaty and all of that, but after World War I, Weimar Germany was not allowed to keep any of her modern battleships. Most have been scuttled anyway. She was allowed to keep some pre-dreadnoughts and update them for coastal defenses. And once ships became 20 years old or so, they were able to retire them and finally replace them. So nominally, that's what she was ordered for. Anyway, she was laid down the following year. She was launched in 1936, and she was commissioned into the fleet in 1939. And she was the lead member of her class, the Scarnhorst class. Gneisenau was her only sister ship. These things are over 32,000 tons light loaded, standard load, and over 38,000 tons fully loaded. They are over 770 feet long, and they pack quite a punch with 9 11-inch guns. And they have 12 5.9-inch guns as a secondary battery, and again several other smaller guns and whatnot. And they have Arado 196s again for reconnaissance. They have 3 screws, and they're capable of a respectable 31 knots top speed. Scarnhorst was actually in service before Prince Juergen by 1940 and was used in several incidents. In fact, the longest, or potentially longest, naval shot in history is credited to her. But unlike Prince Juergen, she did not survive the war. In late 1943, the Royal Navy finally got tired of her, cornered her, and that was all she wrote. And yeah, just to state it for fact, this was totally not allowed by treaty. But again, at this point, by the time she was commissioned, Germany was not really giving much of a flip. Neat battleship, though. And there was a Scarnhorst in World War I. A bit of a secondary namesake, I guess you could say. And a very respectable warship. Interestingly, while she only had 11-inch guns, which are not especially huge by World War II standards, she was always meant to be upgunned with 15-inch guns, but it just never happened for one reason or another during World War II. So her 11-inch guns would stay for the duration of her existence. I appreciate you hanging out with me tonight. Just kind of a fun little chat, I hope. And I thought I'd throw the Bismarck model. You saw the 1/700 scale. This is, like I said, the 1/1100, so a little bit smaller, but it's still quite large. And these were the largest battleships ever built for the German Navy, be it the original Imperial Navy, the SMS type ships, or the Kriegsmarine of World War II. And really, it was the biggest battleship built in Europe. The Italian Littorios were a little smaller, and the British, well, they had battleships like the King George V, never really got to the heights that they did in World War I. She's nearly 825 feet long. Now, under the treaties, even if you're just talking about the London Naval Treaty and the Washington Naval Treaty, just kind of disregarding all the German-specific treaties, battleships were supposed to only be for 35,000 tons. Now, that would be standard load, not full load, but yeah. The Bismarcks were nearly 41,000 tons standard and over 50,000 full for Bismarck herself, and 42,000 standard and 52,000 for Tirpitz, her sister ship. These were laid down in 1936, so right after the Scarnhorst, and Bismarck would be launched and commissioned early in World War II. She was technically what they would call a fast battleship because she was capable of 30 knots. Typically, any battleship able to go over 30 knots was a, quote, fast battleship. So, for her size, she was quite speedy. She had a total of 8 15-inch guns. Super firing. Oops. And she had 12 5.9-inch guns as the secondary battery. And again, she had Arado float planes for reconnaissance. Her armor was rated to defend her against up to 15-inch shells and was particularly geared against 13-inch shells from the French Richelieu class, which nominally is what she was built in response to, but in actuality she was built because Germany wanted a big battleship. But yeah, most famously, Bismarck was only actually ever in one full operation, Operation Rheinbung, which she was first successful in sinking Hood, and then was not successful in being sunk in turn at the Battle of the Denmark Straits. But for more on that, you can check out any number of videos, or ones we've done on this channel. We did one on this ship, and I did a longer one on my personal channel over at Misha. I just thought I'd put it in the video because rumor is that if you have anything to do with Bismarck on YouTube in your video, it helps the algorithm because, yeah, this is one of those ships that lots of people are big fans of. Not saying they're Nazis or anything like that, I just mean it's a very historical ship, and kind of goes back to that romance of the age of the battleship. Well, before we go more with ships, let's talk a bit about my new Luger. How about that? Yeah, this is a gun channel after all. I sure enjoy my models and really anything to do with history. It's not like I can park a battleship out in the backyard, but yeah, Lugers. This one you've seen before. This is World War II BYF code, which is Mauser. It has the late production features. Nominally, manufacturing would end in 1942, although some were assembled from parts as late as 1946 under French occupation. My new one here is a solid early World War I, early Great War example, made in 1915 by DWM. The story, of course, for the Luger pistol is Juergen Luger. He developed this based on the C93 Borchardt. His first patents for it were in 1898. Then kind of early trials and testing in 1899. And an early interested party was Switzerland, who would actually adopt the 1900 model in .30 caliber as standard issue, becoming quite historical. The German military liked the Luger. They checked it out, but they didn't like its .30 caliber. They thought it was a little weak, and then you had a few other things. America even checked it out around 1902, 1903, and had some good things, some not good things to say, but again, they thought it was a little weak. So in 1903, Luger, working at DWM, developed the new 9x19 Parabellum cartridge as an alternative to the 7.65 by 21 Parabellum cartridge. They would make both. And then in 1904, the first German armed branch to adopt a version of the Luger was the Navy. Adopted as the P.04. It had a 5.9-inch barrel, an adjustable rear sight, and shoulder stock. And I showed you one, and we've talked about it in a few videos. As I was saying, while the Navy adopted it, the Army was still not biting. And in 1906, there was a major update. They went to a more modern spring, revised the bolt, the caulking system a bit, and then the German Army would have trials in 1907, and then in 1908, it would have finally adopted in 9mm the P.08 Luger, initially purchasing 50,000 from DWM, and perhaps more importantly, production rights to make them at state arsenals. So beginning in 1910, manufacturing was set up at Erfurt, which would begin around 1911. So this was a standard gun before and of course during World War I. During that war, DWM would produce roughly 1 million, and Erfurt would produce roughly 500,000. Of those, only about 31,000 were the Navy model, so the majority went to the Army, so they had the 4-inch or technically 3.9-inch barrel, and typically did not have a shoulder stock. There was also the P.08 or the P.14 that had the long barrel, often called the artillery Luger. World War I Lugers have very nice rust bluing. They have straw-colored parts. They have checkered wood grips. They have wood baseplate magazines with a nickeled, or at least shiny body. Even later war guns still have very decent, very respectable fit and finish. Well, after World War I, much like with battleships, the Treaty of Versailles also talked about small arms, and it only allowed the new Weimar Republic, Germany, to keep 50,000 Lugers. The rest had to be disposed of or destroyed in some other way. Now these that were going into Weimar service would be the so-called double date Lugers. They'll have the original date followed by, or next to, 1920 over the chamber. And that's not a date, that's just kind of a property mark. In fact, there are some double dates that are marked 1921, 1920, kind of amusingly. The only German company allowed to produce the Luger during the 1920s was Simson. Erfurt was disestablished. In fact, the production line at Simson the tooling came from Erfurt, and DWM was broken up after World War I. Now, eventually, a lot of the assets from DWM would wind up at Mauser, but they wouldn't start to kind of clandestinely take over production, first assembling from DWM parts until the late 1920s. In 1933, once the Nazis came to power, one of the first things they did was take Simson out of the game because, you guessed it, it was a Jewish-owned company. And thanks to the Nazi good old boy network, the Simson production line, formerly Erfurt, was transferred to Kriegsmarine. And Mauser would start producing Lugers, first clandestine, using a date code system and putting an S to kind of maybe suggest it was still Simson. They would drop the date codes in 1936, just going to regular dates, 1937. Then they would drop the S and a little bit later, just using the 42 code, and then this would switch over to BYF in late 1940, 1941. They would start making some economies because the Luger was rather expensive to produce by World War II standards. One of the earliest things they did, they went away from very nice bluing to more basic salt blue. They also quit strawing the small parts, just going to an all-black finish. Then later, they would go from the wood grips to bakelite types, black or brown. And the magazines, too, would be made more economical. I can do this one-handed. They would get the bakelite base to match the grip, of course. Drop-free, these are not. And they would get a new finish, and they would have a new extruded type body too. So, all around, rather different. Sorry, that one's a little stiff. Now, obviously, you know that the P.08 from Walter was to replace the Luger, but the people at Mauser really kind of resisted this for a while. They kept producing brand new P.08s until 1942, when they didn't have a choice but to switch over to the P.38. Nevertheless, during the 30s and 1940s, they still produced over 1 million. Krieghoff, on the other hand, produced around 14,000. And Simson, I've seen a couple of different figures. Some say 12,000. Some say they produced 25,000. Nevertheless, not a huge number. So, yeah, the 1 million DWM made in World War I, and the 1 million that Mauser made in 1930s, 1940s, plus the 500,000 from Erfurt. Yeah, these were definitely mass-produced guns. But of course, they're desirable because it's a Luger. But even though production ended mid-World War II, they stayed in service all the way through the war, and many units, companies, police departments used them through the 50s and even into the 60s. For example, in East Germany, they reworked and reissued Lugers for quite some time. And even though the P.38 is objectively better in nearly every way, there's a certain romance, a certain mystique to the Luger that few other guns, maybe the 1911, but really few other guns have captured in time. So yeah, I had a 1918 before, and it was in good shape, but this one was just a little bit better shape, and it came in the shop, so I upgraded. Years ago, I did much the same with this one here. I had a 1940 dated gun that was fine, but when this one came along, I upgraded, which is kind of what you do with gun collecting. And so that just kind of inspired me to make this video. And with that, what about our final German warship? The one that has probably the most interesting story, the Graf Spee. Admiral Graf Spee. There were 3 members in the Deutschland class. These are classified as heavy cruisers. Deutschland was laid down in 1929, and Graf Spee here was laid down in 1932. These were nominally ordered to replace aging pre-dreadnoughts that were finally old enough that they could be retired out and replaced with newer ships. But the German shipbuilding industry, after being dormant for 15 years, took a little time. She wasn't launched until quite way into 1934, and she wasn't made ready until the beginning of 1936, and they took time. They gave her 3 months of sea trials before declaring her operationally ready in early spring of 1936, at which time she became flagship of the Kriegsmarine, the Nazi German Navy. What do we have here? What is this ship? Well, the Germans called her an armored cruiser, but the British referred to her, at least informally, as a pocket battleship, and they weren't wrong. She is about 610 feet long, pretty normal there, with a peacetime crew of around 600, a little over. But her main armament are 6 11-inch guns, 2 turrets, triple, front and back. Pretty powerful for a little cruiser. And her secondary armament was pretty impressive too. It was 8 5.9-inch guns. And then of course she had the usual anti-aircraft and dual-purpose guns. And originally she had a Henkel float plane for reconnaissance, but later this was upgraded to an Arado 196 like the rest. And she was reasonably fast for a 1930 era ship at 28.5 knots. And she had actually quite good armor. And she would end up being the first German warship to be fitted with a radar. This was used for gunnery targeting, ranging, and whatnot, which would eventually lead to very accurate fire coming from Graf Spee. So, how much did she weigh? Well, the Treaty of Versailles said she needed to weigh 10,000 tons. And Germans were like, oh yeah, of course, yeah, sure, yeah, that's going to happen. Her planned standard weight was a little under 15,000 tons. And her actual standard weight was a little over 16,000 tons. And her full load weight was over 18,000 tons. Yeah, they busted through all of that. And the fun fact is that they kind of let Germany get away with it this early on. France was the main pusher for the Treaty of Versailles, and at this point, England was kind of calling the shots on naval terms, and in 1935, they kind of solidified Germany's right to build ships like this and to have them in the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. So it was at least semi-legal after the fact that it was already being built and nearly in service. But anyway, Admiral Graf Spee, her career. After sea trials, one of the first things she did in 1936 is participate in the non-intervention patrols off of Spain during their civil war. She would do 3 of these, and then she would go to represent Germany during the coronation of King George VI. in May of 1937. And then she would go back to a couple more patrols off Spain. She would also visit Sweden. Her last patrol would end in early 1938, and from there she would make several quote-unquote goodwill visits to various foreign ports throughout 1938 and into 1939, including going into the Atlantic a few times. And of course she would have maneuvers with the Kriegsmarine in German waters. But a ship like this isn't made for peace. On August 21st, she was sent out from Germany, from Wilhelmshaven, as it would turn out for the last time, and she would go into the Atlantic, because obviously there's not war at this time, so yeah, she did. And then on September 1st, she would meet up with a supply ship and refuel and get ready. And then, of course, war. Now, funnily enough, for most of September, she was just avoiding Allied warships because Hitler had not yet given the order for operations to begin. But once he was sure war was a thing, he issued a statement saying, okay, the Kriegsmarine is to go after prizes, is to go after commerce raiding. There were a few express orders. Graf Spee was ordered to obey the rules of a prize capture, so basically the rules of the sea and all that. They were also ordered not to engage in combat with enemy warships, even if the warship was less powerful. Kind of interesting, but they were really concerned about losing their warships. They were really going for commerce raiding at this point. And so yeah, she was given the order on the 26th, and on the 30th of September she spotted her first victim thanks to her reconnaissance plane. And she would kind of find victims and do that. She would meet up with her supply ship a few times to offload prisoners and whatnot. And it must be said, when she did sink a ship, she gave them fair warning. She offloaded the crew. She even insisted the crew send a distress message to be picked up. Her captain behaved quite honorably, frankly. But she was a huge threat. And so on October 5th, the British and the French pulled a bunch of warships off to go hunt for Graf Spee, including France's only aircraft carrier, Buren, and the Ark Royal, several others, Battleship Renown, and yeah, she really bothered them a lot. So they would hunt her, she would avoid her, she would continue to find ships, she would continue to sink ships. But by November of 1939, her engines were tired out. They had been doing a lot of work since she was commissioned. First putting her around the world as a goodwill tour, and now zigzagging all over the Atlantic, because another order that Hitler gave was for her not to stay in one spot for very long. As I was saying, a desperate need of an overhaul. So her top speed was down somewhat, but she continued on, and at this point she's operating off of South America. Not a lot of options. And on December 7, she would find and sink her final victim. She would have a total of 9 ships, and she would have sunk over 50,000 tons. So pretty successful career for just over 2 months. But Graf Spee's wartime career was quite short. On the 12th of December, the Arado 196 float plane broke down in such a way that it just really was a write-off. And this was actually quite a crippling blow, because it had been a vital source of defense and intelligence, and also finding targets for Graf Spee. Well, early on the morning of the 13th, the Battle of the River Plate began. Graf Spee had headed for Montevideo, and there that morning she first spotted and was spotted by HMS Exeter, and she was escorted by 2 light cruisers, Ajax and Achilles. The British split the 2 light cruisers off from the main ship, and they attacked from 2 different directions. And Graf Spee acquitted herself quite well. She used her main guns against the Exeter and her secondary guns against the light cruisers. She did 3 good hits on Exeter, knocking out 2 of her 3 turrets, destroying her bridge, all kinds of damage. But to try to cover her, the light cruisers moved in close, and this forced Graf Spee to break off. So for 30 minutes, the Exeter was able to kind of lick her wounds, and then they would rematch at 7 a.m. Again, Graf Spee would hit her with some good hits and get a hit on Ajax, showing that she had very good gunnery. But at this point, both parties just had to leave. Graf Spee had been hit 70 times. Now, a lot of these had been by smaller caliber rounds. They didn't do a lot but bounce off. And really, she had just superficial damage. But she did have 36 dead, many wounded. So she put into port at Montevideo for repair and offload the wounded crew and give the dead a burial. Okay. She had 72 hours in port per the rules of war, treaty, neutrality. It was estimated it would take 2 weeks to repair the damage. Even though much of it was superficial, the problem is a few systems were knocked out, like the oil refinery plant was destroyed, the desalination plant was destroyed, and maybe worst of all, her galley was blown up. Kind of makes me wonder where they put the galley on the ship, but neither here nor there. This, plus the broken plane and the worn-out engines, and also the fact that she was out of ammunition, or at least mostly so, meant her chances of making it back to Germany were few and far between, even with the 3 British ships kind of waiting for her outside. And just to drive this point home, British intelligence put out fake radio messages that led her to believe that the carrier Ark Royal and the battleship Renown were nearby and coming to reinforce, when in reality they were thousands of miles away. So with this faulty intelligence plus the condition of the ship, the captain radioed High Command in Germany, and 2 options were given. Either try to break out and make it for Argentina, at which time the crew would be interned, or scuttle the ship at Montevideo. Well, caring about the lives of his crew, he decided to scuttle then and there. So on the 17th and 18th, they made ready. The captain, along with 40 volunteers, sailed Graf Spee out and placed scuttling charges, and after making sure vital equipment was destroyed, set her ablaze, and she burned for a couple of days and then sunk. And as most of you know, the captain would later kill himself in his hotel room, probably with a Luger like this. It would have been a little too early for late style production ones, and too early for P.38s. Could have been a Walther though, like a PPK. But for this video, we'll say maybe it's a Luger. And that ended the life of the pocket battleship, little pint-sized puncher, Graf Spee. Well, almost. The eagle-eyed among you, so not me, would have maybe noticed this gun on the table throughout the video. It is not a Luger. This is an Argentinian Ballester Molina, manufactured during World War II by Haftaza. This was standard issue in the Argentine military. and they built 113,000 during and after the war. It's basically a 1911 meets a star Model B. It's in 45 ACP. So why is it in this video? Some of you have already guessed. For a long time, there was a rumor that steel salvaged from the wreck of the Graf Spee was used by Haftaza to build the Ballister Molina. This is not true, but it's a fun story. In reality, the wreck was actually purchased by the British. They purchased salvage rights. And in 1942, 1943, they actually did break up part of the Graf Spee. The reason they wanted it, not for the steel necessarily, but they wanted intelligence. They wanted to take a look at Graf Spee. They wanted to figure out how she had such good, accurate gunnery. So they wanted to check out her radar and some other elements. Now, unfortunately for them, well, they did confirm she had a radar. The intelligence gleaned from the salvage was less than helpful and often considered a kind of waste of money. But anyway, yeah, pretty much anything to do with history, there's going to be rumors. And as long as you know that they're rumors, they actually can be fun and they kind of add to the rich tapestry of historical relics like this, or just replicas, miniatures of historical ships, planes, tanks, what have you. I've always kind of preferred ships and planes. Some friends like more army-related stuff. And I enjoy sharing my hobbies and what I find interesting. And I appreciate you staying with me. This is just, I can't do a live chat, so I'm kind of just hanging out. For me, being blind, of course, having something three-dimensional like a model to feel is about the only way I can really know how something looks. So, yeah. If you like this, I do videos all the time on the personal channel about guns, ships, planes, sometimes even sci-fi and stuff, whatever I feel like. Sometimes just on my cats. But I thought I'd do one using the Graf Spee for the main channel. Again, we're still on vacation, so just to give you some tint, let you know we're here, thinking of you, and that we'll be back probably on the next video we post after this one. So, hope everyone is still surviving A-OK, moving into July of 2020. We appreciate all your past, present, and hopefully future support. And Jay and I will continue to be here as long as we are able. Even if, yeah, new guns might be a little thin on the ground this year, since imports are definitely slower than usual. But we'll try to think up something. So during COVID times, have any of you picked up interesting new guns? Or have you picked up a new hobby or revisited an old one? Me, I used to do model building when I was a little kid, and much like with firearms, I kind of got out of it as a teenager, got back into it briefly in college, then out again. The reason I do the die casts, which are, pre-built for the most part, is that, I can't paint them, and these are already painted and everything, so for me it's better. They didn't have die casts when I was a kid. I think they're neat. It's nice to have the weight of metal. And these models are particularly interesting, again, because they're Japanese-only imports, hence the Japanese writing on the stands. Well, with that, I'm going to call it a night and hit the hay. Any questions or comments, please post them. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out our Patreon page. Links in the description. With that, Jay and I will see you very soon to celebrate 4th of July. This is Misha, See you then.